Hello, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us this morning for this semester's one of this semester's series of TGI FHI, the Franklin Humanities Institute's Friday morning series that gives Duke faculty in the humanities, interpretive social sciences, and arts the opportunity to present on their current research to interlocutors in their fields and in related fields, and allows you, the audience, to get to know us. There is no agenda around interdisciplinarity or disciplinarity in this series, just to present work that faculty are doing that most excites them at this time. I regret that we can't meet in person over breakfast and provide you with the forms of hospitality to which I hope you have become accustomed, but I'm really delighted that we can include colleagues from near and far in this format. On the website of the Franklin Humanities Institute, you can find recordings of past TGI FHIs and also an interview with Anna in which she describes her work. So this morning, I'm very, very pleased to introduce Anna Storti, who received her PhD in Women's Studies from the University of Maryland in 2020. And has joined us as assistant professor in the program in Gender, Sexuality and Feminist Studies here at Duke, with affiliations in Asian American and Diaspora Studies program at the Asia Pacific Studies Institute. Last year, Anna was at Dartmouth College on a postdoctoral fellowship in Asian American Studies and in Gender and Sexuality Studies. And her work deals with a variety of complex questions in the arts, in the interdisciplinary world of understanding certain kinds of arts in a historical perspective. Her research observes the way and analyzes the way in which the past lingers into the present in the history of coloniality and in the understanding of race. Primarily, she is a scholar of feminist and queer theory, Asian American studies, and performance studies. But in the way in which she actually comes to understand these different fields, she also questions some of the premises through which those fields were initially set up, and looks to understand the links between what she calls dehumanization in the present and the imperial and colonial conditions that got us to this point. She has many articles already, even though she just finished her PhD very recently, and many forthcoming ones, reconceptualizing the normative, a glimpse into the radical potential and ultimate failure of queer politics, that appeared in 2014 from Valley Humanities Review. Half and Both on Color and Subject, Object Tactility in Women and Performance, a Journal of Feminist Theory from 2020, and Scenes of Hope, Acts of Despair, De-Idealizing Hybridity in Sayo Woolfolk's World of the Empathics from Frontiers, a Journal of Women's Studies from 2020. Forthcoming is So I Turn Inside, Overcome by the Unbearable, Seeing Myself in Michio Fukaya's in feminist studies. That's coming out at a special issue commemorating the 40th anniversary of the classic anthology This Bridge Called My Back, writings by radical women of color, and All the Women Are White, all the blacks are men, but some of us are brave. Black women's studies. So so commemorating this incredibly important moment, that incredibly important moment in which those anthologies really changed the ways in which we understood questions of race in feminist studies. So her article, Half and Both on Color and Subject Object Tactility, really tries to investigate not only how the mixed race, the idea of being mixed race, is constructed as a fracture between Asian and white, but also, as she puts it, between subject and object. How is my personhood, she asked, contingent on my objecthood? And in an effort to answer these questions, she engages with the artist Jennifer Ling Dachuk, using her work on porcelain as a touchstone to unfold the spaces between subject and object that would assume their easy distinction. She says, trained in ceramics, Dachuk works with porcelain as an ode to her Chinese heritage and also as a meditation on the allure of porcelain skin. Like me, she writes, Dachuk is an Asian American woman with white ancestry. I am drawn to the way porcelain's features, delicate, oriental, still object, seem to reflect Asian femininity. And when I see blue added to the white base of porcelain, as it is in the classic Chinese ceramic work, I feel both colors act as an adhesive, wedding the ceramic surface to connotations of my race and gender. She draws then on a long line of thinking about interracial desire, interracial subjectivity, and how it manifests itself in this relationship between subject and object. Today, her talk is called Racist Intimacies, Asian Americans in Thrall to Desire. And please join me in welcoming her here to Duke and to TGI FHI.
Thank you so much, Ranji, for that generous introduction and for the invitation to speak in this series. I've been fortunate to attend a handful of these talks, and I've been so moved by the work and especially by your introductions. What's funny actually is that this exact date last year is when I had my campus visit, which was also on Zoom. And I feel like being new faculty in this moment is not ideal for reasons I'm sure you can all assume. But in the spirit of what the TGI FHI series offers, I included my email on my title slide, which I'm going to share now. So if you have any questions about my work or would like to meet for a walk, I'd be happy to connect in that way. And I do this because in the span of only a few months here, I've been amazed at how supportive my colleagues are. So I really mean it when I say thank you for spending time in the middle of the semester on an early Friday morning for those of us at Duke, particularly in a semester that, like the previous 4 semesters, is shaping up to be an incredibly difficult one. It's no joke how hard this all is. So an extra big thanks to Chris, Jennifer, Mitchell, and Eli for your work making this happen. So this morning, I'll be talking about racist intimacies, which is a framework I'm assembling to interpret a set of unfolding relations that, among other things, complicates the pursuit of what is understood to be anti-racism. Racist intimacies certainly take into account things like racial fetish, sexualized racial desires, even an unsavory but explicit racial preference in one's romantic history or sexual practice. So in a way, the framework seeks to lay bare a rather straightforward phenomenon, that some intimacies are racist. Taking the idea at face value, racist intimacies describe an event not unlike one that happened almost a year ago, when a 21-year-old Southern Baptist man sought to destroy his temptations, murdering 6 Asian women and 2 others in 3 Atlanta area massage parlors. But intimacies that are racist also, more scandalously, index an ideological dilemma in which race becomes both the problem to be solved and the solution to the problem. In either scenario, the attachment to race is so intertwined with desire, be it a desire to move beyond race, include more races, or destroy one's racialized temptations, that the very fact of race as a formation secured by empire is too easily disavowed or dismissed because, I wager, the feeling of desire simply gets in the way. As a framework, racist intimacies articulate an enduring imperial closeness, where racist desire traffics on the battlefield and in the colony, as well as in the racial imagination, the archive, national sentiment, our homes, our bodies. Racism, like intimacy, can be taught. But in this talk, I wonder if a particular manifestation of the two could better be understood as a form of endurance akin to muscle memory. I want to notice what happens when the physical body comes into contact with empire. The talk's subheading, Asian America in Thrall to Desire, aims to convey what I see as a body's erotic adhesion to empire. The word thrall stays in my mouth longer than I want it to. I have to slow down to say it. When I rush to get the word out of my mouth, as I do sometimes, the meaning gets lost in the sentence. But that disappearance is a definition. To understand the concept, one must slow down to feel it, returning to the very moment of encounter, which is about power, insofar as power, like time, secures control through a collective disavowal, denial, or willful disregard. These are other ways to explain how hard it is to face what's in front of us, rushing to get the word, the taste, the memory out of my mouth. Thrall captures what empire puts us through, a submission without choice. Defined as a state of servitude or of being in someone's power, thrall is usually paired with the word in. In Thrall to Desire, Asian America is suspended in a state of submission. Racist Intimacies offers a means to observe the never absent influence of empire's racial ideologies, specifically as they haunt the sexual and reproductive spheres of social life. So what I'll be sharing with you today stems from my first book project, and so much of the experience, my experience of writing the first book I'm coming to learn, is practicing patience with one's objects and trusting the process of incubation in order to just write one's way through the mess that is the dissertation and its aftermath. I'm almost 2 years out for my dissertation defense, and while the diss and the book stem from the same archive, there are some new developments that I look forward to sharing with you all. But that said, you should expect that in a talk about how empire conditions its subjects, holding them spellbound in curious ways, there will be discussions of violence, some more explicit than others. And I say this because I know that many of the attendees are grieving the recent murders of Asian women. So the cases I share with you today are not uplifting ones, but more of the same. And I think that there's value in letting that sink in. Before I go on though, you should know that I came to this project with a set of concerns regarding the politics of multiracialism, which these concerns are about the progress narratives, the uncritical celebration of interracial love, and even and mostly how popular discourse about racial mixture continues to not reckon with the violent conditions of racialization. So with these concerns in mind, I attend to the unfolding intimacies that emerge from interracial desire, including its reproductive product, the proliferation of mixed race subjects, and its augmentation, the desires that the mixed race subject represents, survives, enacts, or fantasizes about. Taken together, the cases I analyze document the expanding terrain of white supremacy, showing how Western imperialism in Asia and the Pacific forever changed racialized sexuality in the United States and its former colonies. Mixed race subjection, like all racial subjection, is a violent phenomenon with reverberating implications. The growing population of mixed race Asian and white people in particular is met with a peculiar enchantment. Across the global stage, Asian people with white heritage are heralded as figures of the future. As Time Magazine Asia puts it, Eurasians are the poster children for 21st century globalization. Half Asian, half Caucasian, 100% cool. Such claims to futurity and universal mixture participate in settler colonial and anti-Black projects of erasure, as they also reinscribe the sexual life of US empire, in effect, positioning us all in the crosshairs of racism's intimacy games. When Asian people and whiteness meet, it doesn't simply invoke that stereotypical imperial intimacy, the white American soldier and the Asian farm girl, for example. But it augments racism's condition of possibility, creating new intimacies that are as racist as they are dependent upon interracial sex. So intimacy functions as a keyword in my project, but also an interdisciplinary thought more broadly. Its many meanings make it a useful concept to distill the relations between culture and history, subjectivity and resistance. But personally, I'm most drawn to the concept for its ability to lay bare power. Its verb form, intimate, means to imply, state, or make known. As a noun, intimate conveys closeness, the private, the personal, or the sexual. Among the engagements of intimacy offered across American studies, critical ethnic studies, and queer and feminist theory is one approach that demonstrates how love, sex, marriage, and the family are woven into the very infrastructure of empire. A second strand views intimacy as a reading practice, a heuristic and analytic to assess the intimate links between empire, slavery, and liberalism. This work thinks intimacy as a colonial calculus rather than only a quality of being close to one another. So we can understand the first strand as one invested in dominant understandings of intimacy, and the second as invested in emergent and residual intimacies. Lisa Lowe makes this clear in her work, explaining how her study modifies Raymond Williams' schema of the dominant, residual, and emergent. For Lowe, she looks not at dominant intimacies, which are the sexual and romantic intimacies within and in relation to bourgeois family and marriage, but to residual and emergent intimacies, which are the implied but less visible forms of alliance among variously colonized peoples. This move toward residual and emergent intimacies has been quite honestly field shifting. Since the book's 2015 publication, there has been so much incredible work that employs intimacy as a reading practice. And two recent works that I can't recommend enough are Juliana Hu-Pegues's Space-Time Colonialism and Zine Yao's Disaffected. But unlike that work, I want to dwell maybe stubbornly, perhaps regrettably, within the dominant sense of intimacy. I'm drawn to the quality of being personally or privately intimate because it offers a means to observe residual and emergent racist intimacies from a different vantage point. I want to see what becomes legible by looking through the lens of the dominant. And in doing this, I'm trying to observe what it means to be in thrall to desire. For Williams, the residual and emergent teach us about the inner workings of hegemony. What might be uncovered through mining the dominant, knowing that hegemony depends on disavowing the residual and emergent in their myriad forms. A study focused on the dominant sense of intimacy is one that becomes quite intimate with the scenes in which racism's residue festers and with efforts to anticipate racism's emergent forms. What matters is not whether or not this work is possible or if my anticipation is correct. This is, after all, a study about desire, and so much of that goes unfulfilled. What matters is a recognition and confrontation with power. In a poem titled Notebook Fragments, the MacArthur genius Ocean Vuong offers a relevant meditation. An American soldier fucked a Vietnamese farm girl. Thus, my mother exists. Thus, I exist. Thus, no bombs equals no family equals no me. Yikes. In his novel, On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, Vuong offers clarification. Let no one mistake us for the fruit of violence, but rather that violence, having passed through the fruit, failed to spoil it. Notice the dominant and residual as Vuong tracks it through an equation. Without war, his grandfather would not have been in Vietnam. Without bombs, there would be no Vuong. Here, intimacy is an imperial development, a mode of the dominant we can't so easily escape through the passing of generations. Something, let's call it empire, destines Asian America to be in thrall to desire, bound to the sexual contours of imperialism, which repeatedly place Asian and white bodies in close proximity, so close, in fact, that they touch, and through that touching, they meld. Unlike the tired accusation that Asian Americans are becoming white, I examine the whiteness inside Asian America. That is to say, I follow Asian Americans with white heritage, examining the entangled intimacy of what it means to carry converging racial histories. My approach to racial mixture stems from a deliberate understanding that being mixed race is an experience of becoming conditioned by the convergence of multiple racial histories clashing within one body, the violence that passes through the fruit. This convergence is a residual relation of two or more races and their enduring histories. And while the racial collision that is racial mixture may not always be violent, when whiteness is involved, it often channels a violent genesis, a collision between two bodies on opposite sides of imperial or colonial encounter. The remainder of this talk looks to a few scenes in which empire casts Asian people with white heritage, theorizing the ontological dilemma of mixed race subjection alongside the sexual logics of empire that bring Asian people and whiteness together again and again. But first, I offer a clarification on what I mean when I say whiteness. A rather porous omnipresence, whiteness encompasses a racial form, a nationalist agenda, and a structure of feeling that is at once dominant, residual, and emergent, yet so unsustainable that it demands constant recalibrating. Within such demands lives a desire in which Asian America is uniquely positioned to satiate. That whiteness has an Asian fetish is the hypothetical thrust for my project's journey to confront white supremacy's sexual preferences, ranging from the temptations one might wish to destroy to the whitening of the Asian race through racial mixture. It even means confronting someone like Dylan Roof, the Charleston church shooter who wrote in his manifesto that East Asians could be allies to white supremacy. Asian America, to be clear, does not only endure racist intimacies, but it is liable to extend them. In staging this encounter between racist intimacy and racial mixture, I do not intend to convey a direct correlation between the two. Instead, I propose that the Asian and white subject becomes a generative analytic. To study empire's racism, let us confront one of its reproductive products, the mixed race subject conditioned by a history of racist desire and vulnerable to its extension. Scene 1, requesting Asian Barbie. In collaboration with photographer Martin Solheim, requesting access begins with an artist barefoot in the center of an enclosed gallery space. Solheim is always just a few feet away, photographing the performer's every move. The artist, Chanel Matsunami Gouvreau, wears a rose-tinted familial kimono piece, and their hair is entwined with dozens of soft screen-printed sculptures. Audience members line the opposite wall, sitting at a distance. Throughout, an audio track fills the sound waves, telling a story of the time the artist went undercover to investigate whether or not their mixed race body was Asian enough to satisfy an Asian fetish. As spectators watch, Gouvreau's voice travels through the gallery, locating power and vulnerability and the erotic. They begin to weep, reflecting back on childhood in the Midwest, when the racial thing started surfacing. With their womanhood came also this Asian identity. Their rhythmic posing feels natural, exuding an ease of being watched. It's as though they've been trained to seize the attention of a crowd. Never not photographing their movements, Solheim, with his white, male, and fully clothed body, offers a stark contrast to the artist, who now begins to slowly unwrap the kimono and strip. Bare and bearing secrets, Gouvreau, through the speakers, returns us to the past. Not long ago, they made a profile on a sugar daddy, sugar baby website. With Asian Barbie as the account name, Gouvreau created a mild-mannered version of themselves renamed as Shizuka, a Japanese word meaning silence or gentle and quiet child. As is the case with much internet-based sex work, this website featured two main players: older, wealthy gentlemen and younger, attractive women and femmes. Upon finding a person of interest, the men are asked to request access in order to receive more of their potential date's photographs and to begin negotiating an arrangement. Within minutes of the Asian Barbie post going live, the requests came flowing in. When I first sat down to interview Guvro in April of 2019, I learned that the artist's Japanese mother worked as a set builder for a number of Godzilla motion pictures filmed in Tokyo during the 60s and 70s. When their mother moved to the United States, their father's white family discarded her as a visa-seeking green card gold digger. I learned other things too, like how the artist had been searching on Craigslist for freelance work when they came across an advertisement for the Sugar website. At that time, Guvro had been working as an intern, and upon telling their manager that they were looking for side gigs, he proposed they put their young Asian and femme body to work in the clubs or on the street. Guvro sought out to investigate whether or not their body aligned with the racialized and sexualized overtones in many underground economies. Performing as Shizuka, they bought a temporary pay-as-you-go phone and began talking with men who ranged from wanting to schedule and pay for weekly sex, casually date, and fall in love. When they met up with men for dinner, the performances never lasted long. Their body fit the script. At this point in the photo shoot, Guvro's long dark hair flows against one side of their chest, meeting a now exposed white strapless bra and slip shorts. With care, they wrap their wrists in a satin fabric, mimicking both the pre-match ritual Muay Thai boxers engage in to prepare for battle and the post-fight practice of bandaging the hands to facilitate healing. This is a symbol not just of ritual and protection, but of offense. Guvro anticipates conflict. Minutes pass. I almost committed suicide, the artist cries on the voiceover, speaking on behalf of a friend, a mixed-race Asian woman who worked as an escort. Sobs are mixed with words on suicidal misery. Kneeling, the artist rests bare hands across their stomach, moving outward and back again. In a reference to Japanese ritual suicide, the right palm grips an invisible dagger, stabbing the abdomen and slowly pulling the phantom weapon across. Both hands begin unraveling the silk sculptures still interlaced in the artist's hair. Piece by piece, the small sculptures fall onto the kimono. Piece by piece, Guvro unloads a secret, the motive. I wanted to know why. I wanted to know why. I wanted to know. I wanted to know why. I am only human in theory and woman in practice. There is work in queer and feminist studies, particularly on Black female sexuality, that illuminates the potential within racially informed desire, whereby bodies historically exploited and withheld from protection creatively redefine pleasure and agency. In contrast, racial fetish leaves little room for recuperation. While Anne McClintock's feminist intervention into fetishism creates productive distance from psychoanalysis's insistence on the phallus and its emphasis on the scene of castration, her work in Imperial Leather sought not to redeem past narratives of fetishism, domesticity, and empire, but laid bare their historical force and their continuing implication for our time. For Kaji Amin, racial fetishism is the paradigmatic fad relation. Its erotic charge is a temporal one both kindled and upheld by a long colonial history of sociocultural practices. Indeed, it is often through racial fetish that we are reminded of how historical racial injury lives on in the throes of the present. Racial fetish, in other words, is one way to describe racist intimacy. And though some may willingly, eagerly, and ethically enter into scenes of race play, kink or not, and experience pleasure, it is important to note that individual desires cycle back to racial subjection. So while we can say that not all white men fetishize Asian women and that not all interracial sex is an enactment of racial fetish, such erotic relations, as with all relations, remain informed by the ubiquity of racism. It is no wonder then that the very vexed desires that spurred Guvro to enter the racially charged fetish scene were informed by a suspicion, or rather an anticipation, that their body, like their mother's, is embedded in a form of racial hailing, known in slang as yellow fever, and more insidiously as imperial desire. To reread anticipation onto requesting access is to attempt to decipher the fraught relation between bodily autonomy, pleasure, and work. To anticipate is to expect, predict, and in some cases, to prepare for what is likely to commence. Failure is always a possibility. As a state of action in an affective relation, anticipation is a mode of listening to one's surroundings, remembering enough of the past to assume an event and count on its repetition. Anticipation also characterizes the way many of us play. To tease, to bottom, to top is to be cast in a script the other has likely rehearsed or even memorized. Whether or not one successfully anticipates the other's next move, we tend to know our roles. This is not at all to suggest that erotic exchange conforms to a predetermined role play or lineup of events, but to reference the historical weight in many codes of sexual behavior. As much as requesting access is about the artist's affective response to their dabbling in sugar daddy, sugar baby arrangements, it is also about the agency activated in the Asian sugar baby's often assumed submissive position. When I spoke with Guru, they disclosed their intention to scam white men, manipulating them into believing that their fantasy was actualized. The artist fixates on the figure of the white man, anticipating his intentions in order to navigate the ensuing traumatic event and the suicidal misery they failed to anticipate. Scene 2, Fated Fantasies. In 1997, the most wanted person in America was Andrew Cunanan, a gay man of mixed Filipino and Italian heritage who had murdered 5 people, including Italian fashion designer Gianni Versace, before killing himself on a houseboat in Miami's South Beach. His victims were white men, all but one inhabited same-sex desire. Over the span of a few summer weeks before Cunanan met his fate, he had the nation enthralled. The Los Angeles Times called him a chameleon. The FBI's most wanted flyer listed his race as white. Unable to recognize his Filipino-ness, the national media turned its attention to his queerness, keen to reprimand his sadomasochism and his work as an escort, even wrongly speculating that his drive to kill resulted from him being HIV positive, which he was not. Filipino-American newspapers, on the other hand, rarely disclosed his sexuality, but could not resist remarking on his ethnic background. There was a sense of pride and shame spreading across Filipinx communities. Visibility, finally, but at what expense? A non-native son, Cunanan was revered and disowned by Filipino Americans precisely because he did everything right. He looked ahead, worked hard, and climbed the social ladder. On assimilation, he understood the assignment. His father's favorite, Cunanan was a clever, preppy, and precocious boy with an IQ of 147. The Cunanan family enrolled Andrew in an elite prep school, where his charm and mestizo looks helped him win most likely to be remembered by his classmates. He relished being the center of attention, known to tell extravagant and irrational stories of his familial life that fed his reputation as a prolific liar. Could his lust for luxury and aspirational elitism be what made him so unforgettable? Or might it be that his status as memorable is contingent upon what was withheld from those around him, on what escaped our collective memory of what he represents? For all his boasting about his lavish personal life, Cunanan rarely invited friends into his home, shielding them from the humble second-generation immigrant life he wished was not his. By not disclosing his Filipino heritage to those nearest to him, Cunanan navigated life mostly unracialized. His secret pales in comparison to how the American psyche failed to see him as the very sign of US imperial incursions in the Philippines. Disavowed histories, racist intimacies. As Alan Isaac notes, national papers saw a gay prostitute. Filipino-American ones saw an act of assimilation gone wrong. a racially ambiguous subject who operated under the guise of many names and benefited from a lethal ability to adapt. Cunanan lived on as the white-passing, vaguely brown mixed-race Asian, his whiteness secured by Filipino America's turbulent marriage to US occupation. Cunanan has long been a figure of scholarly fascination. Queer and ethnic studies critics have shown how the man's notoriety incites a larger discussion on colonial fantasies unique to Filipinx America. Born in 1969 to a Philippine-born US Navy hospital corpsman and an Italian Catholic mother, Cunanan spent his formative years in San Diego, a racially diverse coastal city known both as a US borderland and a home for military families. Other than Los Angeles and the Bay Area, San Diego houses the most Filipino Americans outside of the island nation, many of whom arrived to San Diego through their affiliation with the Navy. With ancestry extending across multiple generations of US immigration, Cunanan is indeed a child of empire, born into a moment where people like him were in vogue. 1997, the year of his spree killings, was the same year the check more than one box option was approved to appear on the 2000 US Census. It was also this year that Tiger Woods became an international sensation when he won the Masters tournament, making him the youngest and first person of color to win a major golf championship. His professional success and growing fame landed him a seat on the Oprah Winfrey Show, where he famously identified himself as a Kabbalan Asian, a meshing together of Caucasian, Black, Indian, and Asian. Off the course, at the time, Woods was heralded as America's son, despite not being allowed to play on several courses because of his Blackness. Tiger was a rising champion and a glorified icon of the nation's more inclusive future. To follow geographer Arun Saldana in understanding race as not just a fixed subjectivity, but rather as a way of describing, quote, how certain bodies stick to certain spaces, end quote. And Althusser's philosophy of interpolation, the mixed race body is simultaneously stuck to the future and hailed as the future. Scholarship about multiracialism in the humanities and social sciences engages this fixation on what lies ahead, specifically how the product of interracial sex is regarded as a harbinger of the world's first multicultural society, a phenomenon Michael Warner and Lauren Berlant term national heterosexuality, Jared Sexton calls the browning of America, and Tavia Nyong'o names the hybrid future. In revisiting Cunanan, it becomes abundantly clear that the political project of multiracialism has done less to forward an anti-racist future, but has rather distorted historical memory, using difference made common to disguise an imperial legacy. Enraptured by stories of his illicit sex as both a gay man and sex worker, the American public did what they were encouraged to do, to not see race. American colorblindness, however, does not map on so easily to Filipino Americans who are trained by a different racial schema, one conditioned by a colonial history of mixing. Filipinos knew that the surname Cunanan is Filipino, and that many Filipinos, like Cunanan, like me, possess a so-called mestizo look. If race was not the problem for Filipino Americans, the issue became one about shame, maybe Catholic guilt. His failure was ours, less so because we all desired to belong, but because his murderous desires painted us further into the corners of the white mind. Why is it then that Cunanan remains a notorious yet beloved figure in queer Filipinx communities? Something, or rather everything about him posed a threat to Americans. The nation was on watch. Having only killed white men, his murder spree might have been a sensational performance of retribution, an intentional and intergenerational undoing of the white men who occupied the positions of privilege, possibility, and safety denied to his queer brown diasporic body and the bodies that came before him. Ruined, however, by a collective disavowal, his sporadic attacks were more than a kinky fantasy gone wrong, but a contemporary rendition of a queer fantasy under the surveillance of the metro imperial gaze. And here I reference the work of Victor Ramon Mendoza, whose understanding of fantasy is rooted in psychoanalytic thought, where fantasy functions as a form of protection and as an ability to pinpoint the source of desire. Cunanan, with his ancestral histories of US state governments and imperial violence, was, in a way, destined to engage in the most improper intimacies. It is as though his fantasy was fated, geared to both follow through and resist the colonial regulation of Filipino bodies and desires. Whether he set out to kill, or if he was overcome with being geared to calamity, to use the Filipino poet Reggie Cabico's language, Cunanan's story is not only one of murderous masculinity, therefore not just of US imperialism, but it provokes a paradox that shuffles the core of racialized sexuality. Desire is a choice as fatal as it is fated. To raise desire to the power of destiny may seem a careless exaggeration or even a denial of agency and somatic drive. Nevertheless, this contradiction, that erotic choice succumbs to fate, persuades deep reflection into how individual desires, isolated acts, and erotic preferences are neither unique nor natural, but subsist as products, symptoms, and augmentations of empire. Always at odds with US racial politics, Cunanan lingers in cultural memory as that which we must not forget, indeed as a case we must reopen. Allow him this, his most narcissistic desire, to be most remembered, if only to show that belonging is impossible when the group can neither see you nor see themselves as part of the reason why, to invoke Nefertiti, that things like us fall away. Scene 3, precedented violence, educated violation. If one were to trace a genealogy of critical mixed race studies, one would soon find themselves at the University of California at Santa Barbara. Many of the field's most visible scholars either teach or were trained there. The Department of Sociology houses the Journal of Critical Mixed Race Studies. One of the field's founders, Wei Ming Dariotis, earned her PhD in the Department of English. And in 2019, Dariotis founded the first degree granting program in critical mixed race studies in the College of Ethnic Studies at SF State. Kit Fulbach, the author of Part Asian 100% Hapa and Mixed Portraits of Multiracial Kids, is a distinguished professor of art. A UCSB literature student whose name many of us now know enrolled in Professor Fulbach's spoken word course her freshman year. By the time she was preparing for graduation in 2014, the college town of Isla Vista became the site of a massacre, solidifying its legacy as a pivotal location and mining the failures of multiracialism. The student is Chanel Miller, and she's attending a vigil, listening to Richard Martinez give a speech about his Not One More campaign on gun violence. 1 month prior to graduation, Martinez's son was shot just off campus. He was one of 7 victims in the killings perpetrated by Elliot Rodger. Miller, who you see on the screen, is an award-winning author whose memoir, Know My Name, was a New York Times bestseller. The memoir revolves around her experience as the Emily Doe and the Brock Turner Stanford rape case. Elliot Rodger, on the other hand, is notorious for his violent misogyny. His case made incel a household term, and his manifesto has influenced a generation of involuntary celibates. On incel forums, Rodger is referred to as a saint or the supreme gentleman. It is common to see references to ER, his initials, in these forums, and mass violence perpetrated by incels is regularly referred to as going ER. A prominent example is the perpetrator of the 2018 Toronto van attack, who cited Rodger on Facebook. Rodger and Miller are rarely, if ever, discussed together, yet their stories remain forever intertwined. In Know My Name, Miller details what happened that night in Isla Vista. She was walking to a friend's house when 2 police cars tore past her. By email, the campus community was notified that shots were fired. Miller rushed indoors, just as Rodger's manifesto began circulating online. Tucked away in an off-campus apartment, Miller Miller's infamous YouTube videos. And one line continues to haunt Miller. I will punish, and this is Roger, I will punish all females for the crime of depriving me of sex. In Eliot's world, she writes, the unspoken law was that women owed him sex. We existed only to receive him. Sex was his right, but our responsibility. She makes a connection. When headlines first broke after the assault, Brock's smiling photo accompanied every article. Unfair that he is publicly shamed while she gets to hide, commenters said. College is the time when everyone experiences those things, such as sex and fun and pleasure. And here she's quoting Roger. In those years, I've had to rot in loneliness. It's not fair. He and I, Miller writes, were both in some kind of pain, but what type of violence could his pain ignite? To find Roger's manifesto relatable to her own trauma of a highly publicized sexual assault incites a sharp assessment of what Jennifer Doyle has cogently named campus sex, campus security. But in a curious oversight, Miller fails to mention something the two of them share, their race. Their mothers are Chinese and their fathers are white. Why does this matter? One needs only to read the first few pages of Roger's 137-page manifesto to realize that his hatred of women stemmed from the racial interior, where a revulsion of his Asianness engendered a deadly envy. Roger could not fathom how other men seduced white women while he was still suffering as a lonely virgin. Being half Asian, in Roger's eyes, put him at a disadvantage of scoring the blonde women he desired. Still, Roger positioned himself as superior to other men of color. I always felt as if white girls thought less of me because I was half Asian, but then I see this white girl at the party talking to a full-blooded Asian, while a beautiful Eurasian like myself never had any attention from them. Speaking about one of his Latino roommates, Roger ponders, how could he have had sexual experiences with girls, and yet I haven't? I am a beautiful, magnificent gentleman. The mere sight of a young heterosexual couple inspired Roger to fantasize about killing them. Elevated, his rage became more pointed when the men were not white. How, he asks, could a Black boy be able to get a white girl and not me? I am beautiful and I am half white myself. I am descended from British aristocracy. Roger's attachments to British whiteness could be read as an attempt to offset his mixed race, making him, in his words, different from the normal, fully white kids that he was trying to fit in with. Born in London to a British filmmaker and Chinese Malaysian nurse, Elliot Rodger spent the first 5 years of his life in the UK. During his early years, he embarked on a number of international trips and Hollywood premieres with his father. He boasted about his luxurious taste and lifestyle. At age 7, his favorite food was lobster. He felt destined, or at least deserving, of these pleasures. He was, after all, the grandson of renowned photojournalist George Rodger, who was famous for his work in Africa, and also, mostly, of capturing images of mass death during the Holocaust at the end of the Second World War. Like the genocidal motives behind the concentration camps his grandfather bore witness to, Eliot's massacre hinged on a deeper desire to become a dictator, enacting a war on women where, and this is his language, women would be quarantined into concentration camps, other than a few who would be spared for breeding through artificial insemination. In his world, sexuality would not exist. In our world, his presence continues to lurk in plain sight. His case was the impetus of the hashtag #NotAllMen and subsequent hashtag #YesAllWomen trends on Twitter, as well as the driving force behind his status as an incel hero. What is perhaps more sinister is Roger's connection to what is known online as the apocalypse, which is a joining of the words apocalypse and hapa is an indigenous Hawaiian term that means half, and it's oftentimes co-opted by mixed Asians to mean half Asian. The apocalypse names an apocalyptic event in which Asian men with white heritage will rise up against Asian women and their white husbands. Could Roger be the opening act in a drawn-out Eurasian uprising? Could his massacre and its legacy foreshadow an intensifying subculture of those born to Asian mothers and white fathers? Despite the amount of scholarship written about Roger, not enough of it contends with this part of his story. This is a dangerous omission. Other than a few think pieces about his internalized anti-Asian racism, what we have to work with is mostly published in behavioral psychology or sociological journals, giving us much to explore regarding his mental health, masculinity, or political violence. That these topics rise to the surface is unsurprising, considering that once the public learned about Roger, news outlets were quick to deem the murders a result of the shooter's mental health, tagging him as a madman, a lonely outcast, and a rejected brat with a long-concealed mental illness. Similar to Cunanan, Roger's race was not deemed newsworthy, and this is a privilege assigned to whiteness. And it gets worse. Weeks after the attacks, Elliot's father, Peter, spoke to Barbara Walters on ABC 2020. This was the first time a parent of a mass murderer spoke on television. Beyond expressing parental guilt, Peter had hoped to share the warning signs that he had missed as he advocated for improvements in the mental health care system. Sharing that Roger was in therapy since the age of 7, Peter confirmed public suspicion that his son was unwell, despite not having a formal diagnosis. He describes his son as someone who might have had high-functioning Asperger's or autism. Peter insists, however, that his son, while a great liar, was far from evil, suffering instead from an invisible mental illness. Of course, the difference between mental illness and neuroatypicality or neurodivergence is an important one to remember. And though Peter fails to understand the distinction, he is convinced that Elliot is sexist, which Peter discerns as an inbred hatred. He says, "This is the American horror story. When you have somebody who on the outside is one thing and on the inside is something completely different, and you don't see it." But can't the same thing be said about his mixed race? When you have somebody who on the outside is one thing and on the inside is something completely different, and you don't see it. Peter's public appearance did little to appease the victims' families, as it also evaded the contemporary public health issue that is men with guns. Undiagnosed, Roger's mental health remains to be the subject at fault, even as the scholars who set forth to analyze the socialization of mass shooters are keen to note that these killers it's likely for them to be white men who harbor narcissistic, racist, xenophobic, and misogynistic views. As we know, Roger exhibits each of these attributes, his Asian heritage the only marker of difference. But it is this difference that demands my repeating that Roger loathed being half Asian, wishing he was, in his words, full-blooded white. His racial repulsion, however, did little to curb his ego. He was a bona fide narcissist, bragging about his superior memory, insisting that he was a superior gentleman, and remarking that he is the image of beauty and supremacy. It's quite obvious that his sexism is racist. Within the span of an hour, one night in May 2014, he killed 7 people, including himself, injuring 14 in the process. His violent attacks yielded 9 different crime scenes, the first inside his apartment, where he stabbed his 2 Asian roommates. He then drove towards UCSB. Armed, he knocked on the door of the Alpha Phi sorority house. After no one answered the door, he turned around and fired 8 bullets into 2 Delta 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 sorority sisters, who were pronounced dead at the scene. The killer then proceeded to drive into downtown Illa Vista, firing bullets into shops, fatally striking Chanel Miller's classmate in the chest. He struck cyclists with his BMW, injuring others until he crashed and turned the gun on himself. Why do things have to be this way? This question belongs to Roger and is posed on the last page of his manifesto. Harsher gun control laws and a restructured mental health industry might offer momentary appeasement, but unless there is a systemic reckoning with racist desire on a personal level, legal reform stands no chance against the shifting and accruing powers of whiteness. What do we do with the desires people like Roger harbor? Why do things have to be this way? Is it enough to argue that Asian America is in thrall to desire, engulfed in empire's racist intimacies, and liable to their extension? Roger's case, as with all of the cases I engage, offer no redemptive narrative. But might that lack of recovery be the grounds, the canvas, the impulse for living out less racist relations? This is what I propose. Racist intimacies as a framework to interpret a set of unfolding relations that should leave us feeling distressed, desperate for change. This project aims to inspire these feelings, not because I want us to feel these feelings, but because in order to feel otherwise and stay safe, we need to know what we're working against. Racist intimacies become the basis for an urgent examination into the desires which produce such terrifying acts of violence, leaving only a wish that things did not have to be this way. But it is in that wishing, a desire for some different kind of world, that intimacies without racism may reside. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna. It's a really wonderful, rich talk, and just so layered in so many ways. Just as a reminder to the audience, you can put your questions in the Q&A section, and I can then relay them. But while people are just thinking of some questions, maybe I can just start off with something, and I was just I was thinking about this as I was last night I had to introduce Looking for Langston, Isaac Julian's film for the Beckler Museum in Charlotte, and as I was looking at that work again and looking at some of the other work, I was thinking about the way in which the way in which there is this kind of idea of the legacy of a racial intimacy, of a racial violence that also gets sort of manifested in terms of the phantasmatic, in some way, a kind of a reworking of the archive, if you like, so as to speak to the possibility of different kinds of desires as well, part of which includes sadism, masochism of various sorts. And so, I was just wondering if you could maybe sort of say a little bit more. I mean, obviously that's a very different sort of context that we're working with there, and partly he's sort of going into, in a film like The Attendant, going into questions of a museum of slavery that then gets reimagined and reconstituted in this kind of erotic phantasm, both as a kind of critique of what has come before, but also as some kind of sense of a futurity, if you like. And so I'm just wondering if you could just sort of say a little bit more about the scene of the phantasmatic and the way in which fantasy works there. You've given us some work to think of in terms of sort of imperial leather and the question of racial fetishism and Kaji Amin's work. So I'm just wondering if you could just sort of say a bit more on the side of the phantasmatic.
Yeah, and there's so much to say on that, because I don't identify as a psychoanalyst. And so I engage psychoanalytic concepts and oftentimes will use them, and especially thinking about its approach, but it doesn't necessarily drive the project. But when thinking about fantasy, I am informed by what Victor Mendoza says in Metro Imperial Intimacies, which is this idea that fantasy has two roles, one of which is it's a form of protection. The other is that it's an ability to kind of pinpoint the source of desire. And so, I mean, we can even think through, does one ever consent to a fantasy? Is that something that is built over time? How does it arise in the first place? But in thinking through this notion of protection, it's quite interesting, especially in thinking about the context of Andrew Cunanan and the larger, more broad context of Filipinx America, that the fantasies one and that one holds might provide the means in which one can feel otherwise, even if that means a premature death. And so it is this question of fantasy is one that takes seriously the stakes of life and death, but it's also one that troubles what it means to think about survival as hinged on a longer life. And so it's a temporal operation. And so just like racial fetish, which is another instance in which I kind of go and dance with psychoanalysis, but then I come home elsewhere. And I think it's this question of what really is possible when we think about the potential that we're trying to see in these aesthetic movements and these aesthetic gestures, because it is one that I certainly feel that there is a hope and that there is something possible, but it's not necessarily one that I have seen manifested quite yet.
Thank you. Thanks so much. So there's a question from Paul Lay, who says, naming racist intimacies is powerful for highlighting what underlies some eruptions of violence. Could you talk about what you see as potential disruptors to the intimacies?
Yeah, I mean, at least the way I hear that question, disruptions to the intimacies, at least disruptions to a racist intimacy, I think most of the project isn't about the disruption. If anything, the disruption, I hesitated to call it a disruption. I think it's mostly maybe a minor gesture of defiance. I'm not quite sure if that is a disruption. It definitely does make it where the intimacy is maybe paused. But I think the disruption really does lie in a recognition that the intimacy is racist. And so the little minor gestures that we saw predominantly in at least the case that I offered here in Chanel Matsunomi Gouvreau's piece in requesting access, the recognition that one might be able to actually anticipate, listen to the past, but also that comes with a failure, right? There was something that she could not anticipate, anticipating the likelihood that her body indeed did fit the fetish, paired against what she did not understand, which was that the likelihood that she would feel this suicidal misery. And so again, I think it's the impulse to want to find disruption is one that I feel, but it's one that I'm trying to calm in order to uplift actually just the recognition that intimacy is there. And I'm not sure if it's a sustainable one, but it is one that like perhaps in the coda. So the image of the title slide that I had is by an artist named Gina Osterloh, and it's a piece on Shadow Woman, and it's another performance, but it is kind of locating the disruption through paying attention to what the body does differently. And so it might not actually be something where anything looks different in terms of power distribution, but it's tracking the way the body has been trained to associate with a pillar, with a space within an institution, and then having a conversation with artists to see, is there some sort of underlying motive that you're trying to do to disturb and perhaps maybe just disrupt.
Thank you. Thanks, Anna. There's a question from Calvin. Oh, hang on a second. It jumped. Who says, thank you for that rich and provocative talk. I appreciate how you use the frameworks of whiteness and empire. And I'm wondering how you suggest we think about the multiracial nature of US imperial projects and its relationship to intimacies. I'm thinking of Dog Eaters and the Joey Sands character, who seems to bridge both the dominant and emergent forms of intimacy that you outline?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a great question. Thank you, Calvin. I think it is about really embracing the multiplicity of multiraciality. I think any endeavor to do something multiracial will inevitably fail because there are so many different variations. So to think through the example of racial mixture, this is a project about Asianness and whiteness, particularly Asian people mixed with white heritage. And throughout the times that I've shared this work, I inevitably get the question, well, aren't we all mixed? Don't we all have something to say about what it means to hold various legacies? But there is a particular experience in kind of having someone who can cross those racial histories in the way that it's seen through the visual. And so what I would say is to kind of push back against what I think is a really real desire, which is to decenter whiteness in the work that we do, because whiteness is already centered. Why must we continue to center it? But I don't know if it's possible to decenter whiteness. I think that there is a way that we can maybe critique it harder, right? But I do think that a question of what it means to even particularly thinking about your work in multiracial solidarity is to understand that there are variations. And so that racial collision that is possible, that happens within racial mixture looks very different depending on the clashing of the races. And so we can think through the instances of what it means to be Filipino and Black, or Indigenous and Latinx. And so actually understanding that it's not always a violent phenomenon, but that yet racial subjection maintains its violence, I think might open up how unfortunately broad this type of violence is. I'll have to think more about that, but I hope also we can talk about that, Calvin.
Thank you. Thanks, Anna. Shelley Terry, first of all, is thanking you so much for your presentation, and says, I'm interested to learn more about Professor Story's personal engagement and introspection about her own identity as she does this work, to the degree that she feels comfortable sharing.
Yeah, I mean, I think even Ranji, your introductory remarks on half and both is there's a lot of I statements there. There's a lot of me there. It is in a sense kind of like a personal engagement with an artist, a type of synergy that I feel with the work. But yeah, I mean, I'm not under the impression that my work does not have anything to do with my life. Certainly, I think I really listen and hear when Ocean Vuong talks about how On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous. For him, this first book is what he had to write in order to write anything else. And of course, he's kind of speaking within the legacy of James Baldwin, who again had to write that first book in order to work through anything else, and to ask different types of questions. But certainly I'm someone who has identities that I'm an Asian American person with white heritage. And I think what this project has done is that it's made me just shift the critique into a different direction that is very much making me articulate the project as one about violence rather than different forms of expression, because the project, at least in graduate school, kind of began with me wanting to not actually think about the visual, wanting to actually think through the body, which, you know, I guess you can say is something that one can engage in through sight, but really just paying more attention to movements, small gestures, silences. But then a case broke out, which is on Daniel Holtzclaw, which I discuss a little bit in the interview with FHI. And it just derailed my project and my intentions. And it forced me to, well, I became obsessed with trying to understand why is it that, and how is it that perhaps white Asian people with white heritage might actually become white in the same, through the same legacy that Italians have become white or the Irish have become white. And essentially a projection that I'm trying to make in the project, which is anticipating that a certain class of people, and it's not even just confined to Asian Americans. I think that a lot of work in Latinx studies is also doing this work, and it very much engages what's on the surface of the skin, so flesh and color.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thanks. So Shelley Terry has a kind of follow-up question to that, which I think is quite interesting, and maybe actually allows you to expand a little bit on what you just said as well. That there's been this examination of similar kinds of questions in Latinx studies, and the question is, I'd be interested to know how she finds the research is generally received in academic settings. I would imagine ... that are also largely white spaces. I suppose there are two questions there. Is that would you say that in your academic world that is the case? Is number one perhaps, and then also how the work has been received, given I suppose that in many settings the study of race is not multiracial in this way.
Yeah, I mean, another great question, because it does kind of, I'm already trying to organize the different spaces that I interact with in the academy. And so we can think about how the work is received by gender studies, Asian American studies, performance studies, and then also critical mixed race studies. And so to start with performance studies, I mean, I think it's received quite well because it is performance studies that informs the way that I interact with the body, thinking through the trends of the 60s and 70s, and particularly thinking about endurance and durational art, how the body becomes the site in which one can ruminate and excavate the past, and particularly racialized, gendered, sexualized past. Asian American studies and ethnic studies more broadly, I mean, I think it's about understanding that, at least for me, what I understand and what I've heard is that there is an eagerness to talk about complicity in Asian American studies, particularly understanding how Asian American studies and ethnic studies is a field that emerged out of political struggle. And there's a lot of, so like that history and activism looks a lot different when we think about how the term Asian American has shifted from that emergence and politics and revolutionary radical politics into now just kind of it's maybe apolitical. It's an identity marker. And so I think there's eagerness for people who are eager to listen to how, what does it mean that Mitch McConnell's wife is an Asian woman? What does it mean that Richard Spencer dated a number of Asian women? What does it mean that Dylan Roof thinks that Japanese people in particular are ideal allies for white supremacy? And so there is, on the other hand, when I think through critical mixed race studies, that's where it becomes a little challenging for me. And it's, I think, because there is a way in which, the current trend is to decenter whiteness. And it makes sense given that the emergence of the field was about mostly thinking about what it means to be mixed Black and white, and then Asian and white. And a lot more rich stories just were not being discussed. And so now we see a lot of great work. Maya Washington's book on Blasians is one that I always turn to, but it's kind of also thinking of how there is a subsection, I think, in the academy that does, as you mentioned, Ranji, treats race differently. And so I oftentimes get that question, aren't you just reifying race? Aren't you, we all are mixed anyways. We all kind of come from Africa. And so we all have this collision of races that you talk about. But I do think that first of all, racial mixture, it needs to be said, targets the singularity of indigeneity and Blackness in particular. And not every mixed person needs to claim mixedness, but that there is nonetheless this embodied reality for those whose racialized bodies, as I mentioned, kind of traverse different racial borders, especially different racial borders that what Ruth Wilson Gilmore calls group differentiated vulnerability to premature death. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that it's a long conversation that I'm happy to have with you at another time too.
Thank you. Thanks so much. So I was wondering actually if you could unpack a little bit how you're thinking about what violence is, right? I
Mhm,
mean, I'm just sort of
mhm,
thinking about that last section in particular, but it does seem as if, we have all sorts of different kinds of registers of violence, right? From the massive scale of massive bombs to to self-harm, basically. And uh, and I'm just sort of wondering about how one sort of might think about the different kinds of registers, the different kinds of scales of violence. And well, I mean, actually, just in my hesitation there, register of scale, is there a difference in degree or of kind, in how, when you use that term violence, how are we supposed to get our heads around the sort of massive differences here, and how, to some extent, this sort of the scale of the historical weight on the body as well, right?
mhm.
How one actually understands those, that different kind of idea of violence.
Yeah, there certainly are scales, and I think that it's important to note the difference between interpersonal violence, the varied forms of that, physical violence, emotional violence, manipulation, and then thinking through, as you mentioned, bombs and war and the scale of empire and colonialism, violence of memory, violence that one non-consensual violence. There's way that is violence something that equates to pain? And so the way that I'm thinking about it is through affect and feeling, and knowing that I don't know if it's the most productive thing to compare violences, and to kind of see which violence is the most violent, which is the least violent. But I do think that we can think through the realm of what is most explicit, what is even viewed as a type of violence that would engender, certain laws, certain policies. Not all violence is treated differently. Not all violence is regarded as violence. But in order to think through what violence is, I mean, I think fundamentally it is something that, and it's a word that I mentioned a couple times, but safety. What does it mean to feel safe? Is that possible? Thinking through what Christina Sharp says is anti-Blackness is the weather. We are all kind of within a system in which violence is present. But even just thinking through just, you know, the recent, like a year ago, the Atlanta case and all the different types of anti-Asian violence and racism that's been happening has provoked this hate crimes law. And so even if it's not hate, but somehow affect rises to the surface when thinking about what violence is. And unfortunately, I think safety is oftentimes viewed as a way to keep certain communities protected, and to protect certain communities while also not protecting. But even that desire for protection, I think, distracts our attention from the real work, which is thinking about and acknowledging how white supremacy continues to find life in empire, and in the interlocking racisms that are anti-Black, anti-Asian, xenophobic, anti-immigrant, and settler colonial. But it is something that, I mean, violence is a key word, and it's one that I think I'm trying to think through, and it's also in a way that doesn't replicate it. And I understand that there is a way where even repeating acts of violence could be an act of violence, and trauma, right? And triggering that. But, you know, I'm doing it because I do think it's important to just let it sink in.
Thank you. Thanks so much. There's a talk from Kim Lam, who, first of all, says great talk, and I should tell you that there's just general praise that is going on also over here, in the questions, etc. I'm interested in Roger as a figure, she says, who acted out the fantasy of omnipotence. As you portray him, he is an Oedipal imperial winner entitled to the feminized goods, at least psychically. How do you see the narcissistic injuries of racism figuring into Roger's enraged sense of entitlement?
His narcissism is what spurs. I mean, and I'm not even sure if it is exactly a narcissism that is a pure narcissism, or if it's something that's informed by what his father calls as this invisible, undiagnosed mental illness. But it is precisely, I think, something that stems, it's a type of envy. It's a deadly envy. It's one that makes it so it actually follows in line with something that he was likely taught. I mean, even if he didn't believe that, if he believed that he was full-blooded white, he would have had access to the women that he desired. But in a way, he's also trained to think that people who are mixed race are either going to follow through with hybrid vigor and have kind of the best of both worlds. But it's a different gendered expression. Like that is a discourse that gets labeled onto people who are feminine and mixed race, less so than especially Asian men. And so his is a conversation and thinking through his revulsion of being Asian is of Asian masculinity. It's not necessarily even because he doesn't care for his mom. His mom was actually someone who did a lot of care and holding of him, because he adored his mother more so. But his mother is also someone who bought him the BMW and catered to his gambling addictions, and so this concept of how he is truly a narcissist is not the full story.
Thank you. Thanks. That's fascinating. Sunhei, you says, it seems to me that there is a logic of exchange, however unbalanced, within the concept of enthrall. As in, there is a reward and cost to submitting or taking on the desires of whiteness or racist intimacies. I sense that Anna is troubling the very notion of racial submission itself, that it can nurture a kind of entitlement. And I was wondering if Anna had more to say about that power dynamic.
Yeah, I mean, troubling. I mean, it does seem like my attachments and interests in thralldom and it is really residing within this notion of submission. What does it mean to be within the power? But I think it's, again, I just keep on coming back to the body. So even when I try to write out what I mean by enthrall to desire, I end up kind of doing this a lot and thinking through the cycles, the embeddedness, the adhesion. In a way, it's a kind of dance and a playful, teasing one. But there is a way in which the excitement, the potential to maybe gain power is one that maybe throws it all into suspension. Because to be enthralled to desire does not necessarily rid one of agency or a drive or intention. But it is precisely, I think, once one recognizes the situation at hand, that's when something maybe more pleasurable can happen.
Sorry about that. I was just clearing my throat a few times, so I had to mute. Calvin has another question and says, could you say a little bit more about the performance that you analyze in the first part of your talk? I was struck that the artist described the goal in terms of wanting to know rather than, for instance, healing. Could you talk about the relationship between performance, knowledge, and suffering and healing that the work allows you to think through?
Yeah, because there is very much a combination of all of that: performance, knowledge, suffering, and healing. I just don't know if healing is the end game, right? I do think that it's actually about a provocation. So of course the healing happens through the wrapping of the wrist with the lace. But when thinking through can you repeat the first part of the
Yes,
performance?
sure, yes. Carvin says, I was struck that the artist described the goal in terms of
Okay.
wanting to know rather than, for instance, healing. So maybe, I mean, given that you have just said that healing is maybe not the end here, maybe you could expand a little bit on what that wanting to know is.
I mean, it certainly is, I think, a form of understanding what something like repetition plays in one's life, and anticipation. And so this knowledge, is it a confirmation of a suspicion? But it ultimately is thinking through that final part of that section in the audio, wanting to know and realizing that one is only human in practice and in theory, and woman in practice. And so it is this kind of, I mean, it may be a very simple feminist one that is thinking through what does one have access to, a larger conversation about liberal humanism. Knowing is something, and that's very much ingrained in a certain approach to intimacy that is one that structures the way that people are expected to live, right? There's an expectation that one partners in a certain way at a certain moment, and builds into thinking through just like a heteronormative mode of social life. But it's the knowing that is achieved through bodily movements.
Okay, thank you. Well, I mean, we have 1 minute, and it's kind of a big question here from Heba, and really Heba is talking about the kinds of frustrations of the of how one responds to the white man, she puts it. I mean, I think that one might want to sort of nuance that idea of the white man a little bit here as well, given your talk, as mixed, how to respond to the white man who looks at us and sees a beautiful exotic woman who has opinions, how to explain and respond to the white man's not malintentioned characterization of the Asian American woman, who he understands as fitting a particular script.
So it seems like the question is asking what to do with white men who engage with Asian women in a certain type of way. I mean, that is the question in a certain sense. But I do think it's very cogent that you called it a frustration, because it does kind of lead back into a type of mundane experience, a microaggression, something that has become so common, right? It's a difference that's made common. I mean, in terms of what to do, I think it's also maybe the question is to pose that to white men and not to me, because I think it's a matter of thinking about survival and knowing that there are many players to the game, and the talk is meant to like actually have conversations with people who and with all of us who have different types of desires, and invite you to kind of look inward and think through, is this something that's going to play into the desire that I think a lot of us are still kind of hearing, which is the desire to be anti-racist. And you know, what would it actually look like to embrace that frustration and use that frustration as the method, the impulse to have a frustrating conversation, because I think that that's where we are.
Well, thank you, Anna. Thank you so much for this very rich talk, and for your generosity with responding to the questions here. We've gone past time, and have made you work quite hard here. So I think that we should probably close out. But I just wanted to remind everyone that there's a really wonderful interview with Anna on the website, and also some suggestions for further reading of articles that are already out, and some others that are a couple that are forthcoming as well. I really just look forward to continuing the conversation in this and other fora.
Thank you so much, Ranji, and thank you everyone for attending.
Thanks a lot. Bye.